Somewhere inside the headquarters of the FBI for more than 40 years, there was a file with the word Bigfoot on it. Not a joke, not a prank somebody slipped into a drawer. A real numbered case file kept in the same record system that holds the Bureau's work on organized crime, espionage, and public corruption. And for 4 decades, almost no one outside that building knew it was there. Then, on an ordinary afternoon in June of 2019, the FBI did something with that file it had never done before. It put it online, in public. 22 pages, free for anyone in the world to download and read. A genuine United States government document about the most famous monster in North America. And the moment people started reading, they realized something. This was never going to be a story about whether Bigfoot is real. It was going to be a story about one envelope, about 15 mysterious hairs, and about a question somebody asked the FBI that the Bureau, to this day, has never been able to fully answer. The file has a beginning. It has an ending. But it has a hole right in the middle of it. And that hole is the reason we are here.
I'm Alex, and today's Bigfoot evidence is a real FBI file.
To understand why the FBI ever touched the subject, we have to go back 1 year before that file even begins. To 1975, and to a book almost nobody outside of Washington State has ever heard of. In 1975, the United States Army Corps of Engineers published something called the Washington Environmental Atlas. If that sounds boring, that's because it mostly was. It was a large, second edition reference book, a survey of the state's rivers, its geology, its plant life, its archaeological sites. It reportedly cost around $200,000 to put together, which in 1975, money was a serious government investment. This was not a tabloid. This was a dry, official, taxpayer-funded document meant for planners and engineers. And then, somewhere around page 50, in between the genuine science, the atlas did something extraordinary. It included an entry on Sasquatch, not as a folk tale, not in a local legends sidebar with a wink. The atlas described Sasquatch the way it described everything else in its pages, matter-of-factly as a feature of the Washington environment. It gave a physical description, a creature standing as tall as 12 feet, weighing as much as half a ton, covered head to foot in long hair except on the face and the hands. And it included a map, an actual map of the state with dots marking reported sighting locations. Now, to the atlas's credit, the authors were careful. They openly admitted the creature's existence was, in their words, hotly disputed. They noted that skeptics believed not one piece of the evidence would survive serious scientific scrutiny. And they ended the section with a line that I genuinely love because it is the most diplomatic sentence a government agency has ever written about a monster. If Sasquatch is purely legendary, the legend is likely to be a long time in dying. But here's the part that matters for our story. Tucked into that same entry was a single, specific, factual-sounding claim. The atlas stated that hair samples believed to be from a Sasquatch had been inspected by FBI laboratories, and that the conclusion was that the hair belonged to no known animal and no human being for which comparison data existed. Read that again. An official Army Corps of Engineers publication was telling the public that the FBI had tested Bigfoot hair and that the results were a mystery, that the most respected forensic laboratory in the country had looked at it and could not say what it was. When that atlas came out, the press noticed. Newspapers ran the story in the summer of 1975. The Army had officially recognized Sasquatch, the headline said, and the detail that traveled fastest, the detail that lit up every Bigfoot research circle in the country, was that line about the FBI, because if it was true, it was the single most important sentence ever written about this subject. It meant the government had physical evidence it could not explain. And here's a detail that makes the Atlas stranger still, in a good way. That sightings map was not decoration. The data behind it lined up closely with sighting and footprint records the Canadian researcher John Green had compiled years earlier, which means the United States government's official atlas was, in part, leaning on the fieldwork of a private Bigfoot investigator. The atlas even noted reports from as far away as the Pamir Mountains of the Soviet Union, a genuinely odd thing to find in a Cold War-era U.S. Army document. Some people at the time wondered aloud whether the whole Sasquatch entry was a quiet joke smuggled into a serious book. But $200,000 in years of review is an expensive way to tell a joke. And the atlas did not land in a vacuum. This was the height of the 1970s, when parts of the Pacific Northwest were taking the creature seriously enough to legislate around it. Skamania County, Washington, a place we spent real time on in our video on America's Bigfoot hotspots, had already made it illegal to kill a Sasquatch. When a federal atlas described Bigfoot in plain, factual language, it fit a moment when the line between folklore and official recognition genuinely felt blurry. And one man in Oregon read that line and decided he was going to get to the bottom of it. The man's name was Peter Byrne. And if you are going to understand this file, you have to understand him, because almost everything in those 22 pages happens because of who he was. Byrne was not a hoaxer. He was not a hobbyist who'd watched too many late-night documentaries. By 1976, Peter Byrne was, by a wide margin, one of the most serious and most respected creature researchers alive. His life reads like an adventure novel that an editor would have rejected for being too much. He was born in Ireland in 1925. He served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. After the war, he went to northeast India and worked on a tea plantation, and then he spent 18 years running big game hunting safaris in Nepal. He found his first footprint that he believed belonged to a Yeti back in 1948 in the Himalayas, the same abominable snowman we dug into in our Yeti video. And in the late 1950s, his Yeti obsession got him a remarkable sponsor, a wealthy Texas oil heir named Tom Slick, who funded Byrne's multi-year Himalayan expeditions to track the creature down. Tom Slick is a whole story of his own, and one I want to give its own video down the line, so I'll leave him there for now. When that Yeti work wound down, Slick brought Byrne to the Pacific Northwest in 1960 to do the same thing for Bigfoot. So by the time our file begins, Byrne had been chasing unknown creatures on 2 different continents for nearly 30 years. But here is the single most important thing about Peter Byrne, and the reason his name on a letter actually meant something. Byrne was a skeptic. Within the Bigfoot world, he had a reputation as the man who was more likely to talk you out of believing something than into it. He turned down sightings he found unconvincing. He looked at famous, beloved pieces of footage with a cold and critical eye. He was, in many ways, the opposite of the stereotype. A careful, buttoned-up investigator who wore a trademark ascot and treated the whole thing like the serious scientific question he believed it to be. And there is one more piece of him worth knowing. In that very year, 1976, Byrne published a book on the subject, and its title tells you everything about his mindset: The Search for Bigfoot, Monster, Myth, or Man? Notice the question mark. He was not selling an answer. Across his long career, he became one of the loudest voices for what's called the no-kill position. The argument that if you ever did corner one of these creatures, you photograph it, you never shoot it. Remember, this was a former professional big game hunter who had completely reversed himself. He once said he had shown people that photographing a rhinoceros was worth 1,000 times more than shooting it. This is the resume of the man holding the pen. By the mid-1970s, Byrne was running an organization called the Bigfoot Information Center and Exhibition out of the small town of The Dalles, Oregon. It was part research project, part small museum. And it was backed financially and institutionally by a group out of Boston called the Academy of Applied Science. I want you to remember that name, the Academy of Applied Science, because it becomes important later in a way you will not see coming. So in the summer of 1975, Peter Byrne, professional, skeptical, deeply experienced, reads that line in the Army Atlas claiming the FBI had tested Sasquatch hair. And his reaction is not excitement. His reaction is the reaction of a careful man. He doesn't believe it just because it's printed in a government book. He wants to know if it's true.
And honestly, that instinct is exactly why I trust this source as a guide through this file. He could have just repeated the rumor. It made his whole field look good. Instead, he went straight to the source to check it.
Before we get to the letters, there is one more thing we need, and that is the hair itself. Because Byrne didn't just want to ask the FBI a question. He wanted to hand them a sample, and the sample he had was, by his standards, a good one. Byrne later described where it came from, and the account is worth slowing down on. There had been a sighting in the coastal mountain range of Oregon, wilderness country not far from the California border. What made it stand out to a man as picky as Byrne was who the witnesses were? They were not tourists, they were not teenagers. According to Byrne, they were 2 employees of the United States Forest Service, men who worked in those woods for a living, men trained to know what they were looking at. And they reported seeing something they could not identify. They also found footprints, barefoot prints, roughly 14 inches long. For Byrne, that was the magic phrase, a credible sighting. So he and his people went out to the site themselves to search it. I want to pause on that witness detail because it is the kind of thing this channel cares about. In report after report, and we have covered a lot of them, from the wildland firefighters in Oregon to the trail cam case in the Ouachitas, the single most powerful variable is rarely the footage or the footprint. It is who's doing the looking. A Forest Service employee is a trained outdoor observer. They know what a bear looks like at a distance. They know what a person looks like. They are paid to be unsurprised by the woods. So when 2 of them say they saw something they could not place, a careful researcher does not dismiss it. But a careful researcher also does not stop there. They go looking for something physical, which is exactly what Byrne did. And this is the detail I think about the most. When Byrne got to the location, he noticed 2 trees standing very close together, close enough that the gap between them was narrow. His thinking was simple and physical. If something with broad shoulders and a large frame had pushed through that gap, it would have had to squeeze. And if it had to squeeze, it might have left something behind. So he looked, and there, snagged in the rough bark, somewhere between 3 and 5 feet off the ground, he found it. A small tuft of hair attached to a tiny piece of skin. He estimated it at about 15 hairs. Now, I want to be fair and honest here because that is the entire point of this channel. We cannot independently verify this origin story. It comes from Byrne himself. We don't have the Forest Service men's names. We don't have a separate report. And the height at which the hair was found is exactly the kind of detail that's a little too convenient. And I already know some of you in the comments are typing, "That's just deer brushing a tree." Hold that thought because you are closer to the truth than you might want to be. But here's what we can say for certain. Whatever those 15 hairs actually were, Peter Byrne genuinely could not identify them. By his own account, it was the first unidentifiable hair sample his organization had obtained in 6 years of work. He bagged it, and he decided it was going to Washington. Set the record straight once and for all. On August 26, 1976, Peter Byrne sat down and wrote a letter to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This letter is page 1 of the file. This is where the document we can actually read begins. The letter went out on the official letterhead of the Bigfoot Information Center and Exhibition. And I'll be honest, there is something wonderful about imagining an FBI mail clerk opening an envelope with that printed across the top. But Byrne's tone inside the letter was not whimsical at all. It was precise. It was almost lawyerly. And that precision was a deliberate choice. Byrne had been doing this long enough to know that the fastest way to be ignored was to sound excited. So the letter has no breathless language in it at all. No historic, no proof. Just a clear request from one professional to another. If you did not know the subject was Bigfoot, you would assume you were reading a letter about a routine forensic question. That tone is the whole reason the next page of the file exists. He had 2 requests, and they were separate. The first was about that Atlas claim. Byrne wanted the FBI to confirm it or deny it. He asked the Bureau to kindly, to set the record straight, once and for all, inform him whether the FBI had ever examined hair that might be that of a Bigfoot, when it took place, if it took place, and what the results were. Notice the construction of that, if it took place. Byrne was not assuming the rumor was true. He was a researcher building a clean foundation. He explained that from time to time his organization had been told the FBI possessed such hair, but he was not going to repeat that as fact until the FBI itself said so. And then he added one more sentence, and it is the sentence that I think did the heavy lifting. He wrote simply, "Please understand that our research here is serious. That line is doing real work." Byrne knew exactly how a letter about Bigfoot would look landing on a federal desk. He knew the easy thing, the expected thing, was for somebody to laugh, crumple it up, and drop it in a wastebasket. So he was getting ahead of it. He was telling the Bureau, "I am not a crank. Treat this the way you would treat any other inquiry." And here is the genuinely surprising part of this whole story. It worked, the FBI wrote back. The reply came fast and within about 2 weeks. It was signed by a man named J. Cochran Jr., and his title matters. He was an assistant director of the FBI working in the Bureau's scientific and laboratory side. This was not a form letter from a junior clerk. This was a senior official in the FBI's science division answering a letter about Bigfoot. And what Cochran wrote back is, to me, the single most fascinating thing in the entire file. Because it did not answer Byrne's question. It deepened it. Cochran told Byrne that since the Washington Environmental Atlas had been published, the FBI had received several inquiries just like his. Byrne, in other words, was not the only person who'd read that line and gone looking. People had been writing in, so the Bureau had every motive to settle the matter cleanly, and they searched, and they could not find it. Cochran's letter stated that the FBI had been unable to locate any references anywhere in its files to such an examination ever taking place. There was no record, no report, no memo. As far as the FBI's own paperwork was concerned, the famous Sasquatch hair test that an official Army atlas had described to the entire country had simply never happened. And I want to flag how unusual the FBI's posture here actually is. Think about what they could have done. The easy move, the move that costs the Bureau nothing, is a single sentence. "We do not comment on this." Instead, a senior official acknowledged the rumor by name and told a private citizen the plain truth, that they had searched and found nothing. That is not the behavior of an agency trying to bury something. That is the behavior of an agency genuinely a little annoyed that a false claim with its name on it was loose in the world and wanting it cleaned up, which, when you think about it, is the most relatable thing the FBI does in this entire file. But the FBI did not stop there, and this is the part I find genuinely impressive. They didn't just check their own filing cabinets and shrug. They went and tracked down the editor of the Atlas itself, a man identified in the documents as Dr. Steve Rice up in Seattle. They asked him directly, "Where did you get this? What is your source for the claim that the FBI tested this hair?" And the Atlas editor could not answer either. According to the file, after checking, he was unable to locate his own source for the reported FBI hair examination. Sit with that for a second. A $200,000 government publication printed a specific factual claim about an FBI laboratory result. The FBI looked and found no evidence it ever did that work. The man who edited the Atlas looked and could not say where he had gotten the claim. The story had no origin. It was a sentence that everyone repeated and no one could trace. A rumor that had somehow walked into an official document and gotten itself printed as a fact.
This is the honest heart of the whole thing. That famous FBI tested Bigfoot hair and it was unknown story. It traces back to nobody. It's a game of telephone with no first call. And I personally think that's a stranger mystery.
So the first half of Byrne's inquiry had hit a wall, a strange hollow wall, but a wall. The legendary earlier FBI test could not be confirmed because as far as anyone could prove, it had never existed. A lot of people would have stopped right there. Byrne did not, because remember, Byrne had something in his pocket. He had those 15 hairs. So a couple of months later, in late November of 1976, Byrne wrote to the FBI again. And this time he was not asking a question. He was asking a favor. He explained that his organization did not often come across hair it couldn't identify, and that the sample he now had, about 15 hairs attached to a tiny piece of skin, was the first such sample they'd obtained in 6 years. He asked whether the FBI would be willing to arrange a comparative analysis. He wanted their lab to look at it, and the FBI said yes. In a letter dated December 15, 1976, Assistant Director Cochran agreed to examine the sample. Now he was careful about how he framed it, and the framing tells you something about the Bureau's thinking. Cochran explained that the FBI's laboratory existed to examine physical evidence connected to criminal investigations. That was the job. Testing monster hair for a private researcher was very much not the job. But, and here's the opening, Cochran wrote that occasionally, on a case-by-case basis, in the interest of research and scientific inquiry, the Bureau made exceptions to that general policy, and for Byrne, it would make one. I want to be clear about what that does and does not mean, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets stretched. It does not mean the FBI believed in Bigfoot. It does not mean there was a secret task force. It means a senior official decided that a serious-sounding request from a known researcher was worth a courtesy. That's it. But it is also true, and the believers are not wrong to point this out, that the FBI did not have to say yes. They could have declined in one polite sentence. They didn't. They chose to put a real federal laboratory to work on this. And there is a small, almost invisible line in that December letter that I think is the most revealing thing the FBI ever wrote about Bigfoot. Cochran framed the exception as being made in the interest of research and scientific inquiry, not public safety, not an investigation. Research and scientific inquiry. In other words, the FBI's own stated reason for touching this at all was plain curiosity. The same curiosity that probably brought you to this video. The Bureau was not confirming a creature. It was just, briefly, a little bit interested and honest enough to say so in writing. Before we open the lab report, and I promise you we are about to, do me one quick favor of my own. If you're finding this interesting, if you want this channel to keep digging through real documents like this one instead of recycling the same blurry photos everybody's already seen, the single most helpful thing you can do is hit subscribe. That's it. It tells the algorithm that honest, slow, evidence-first work is worth showing to people. All right, let's see what the FBI lab found. Here's something I appreciate about this file. When the FBI agreed to do the work, they actually did the work. They didn't glance at the hairs and send back a one-line brush-off. The lab report, when it came, describes a real forensic examination. The sample traveled to the FBI laboratory at the time housed in the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. And the analysts there put those 15 hairs through the standard hair identification process of the era, which was genuinely rigorous for its time. According to Cochrane's report, the hairs were examined using transmitted and incident light microscopy. In plain terms, that means they studied the hairs under specialized microscopes, with light passing through the samples and reflecting off them to read their fine structure. And they looked at specific things. They studied the root structure of the hairs. They studied what's called the medullary structure, the medulla being the inner core that runs down the center of a hair, which differs in revealing ways between species. They measured the cuticle, the scaly outer layer. They made what are called scale casts, which capture the pattern of those surface scales in detail. And then they did the most important thing. They compared the unknown hairs directly under a comparison microscope against hairs of known origin. Reference samples from animals the lab could identify with certainty. This is not nothing. This is the same basic family of techniques the FBI used in actual criminal casework in the 1970s. Whatever you think of the final answer, the hairs were not dismissed. They were examined the way real evidence gets examined. Now, in the interest of being completely square with you, I have to add the caveat modern forensic science would add. Hair comparison by microscope is good at telling you the general type of animal a hair came from. It is genuinely reliable for a question like deer versus primate versus human. What it is less good at, and what the science community has since become much more careful about, is fine individual level identification. But that limitation does not really cut against the result here. Telling a deer hair apart from a primate hair is exactly the broad category question this method handles well. If the FBI lab said deer family, the method was more than strong enough to stand behind that. The honest caveat is not that they got it wrong. The honest caveat is simply that 1977 was 1977. And then, on February 24th, 1977, J. Cochrane Jr. wrote the letter with the result. The conclusion was one sentence. The hairs the FBI lab found were of deer family origin. Deer, not an unknown primate, not a creature unknown to science, not no known animal, which is what that ghost of an atlas claim had promised. Just deer. The sample most likely came from a deer, or something close to it in the deer family that had brushed up against, yes, 2 trees standing close together in the Oregon coastal range.
I won't lie to you, the first time I read Deer Family Origin, it landed like a slowly deflating balloon. But that feeling right there is the test. An honest channel reports the deer. The sensational ones just quietly skip this page. We are not skipping it.
So that's the file, right? Question asked, favor granted, hair tested, answer delivered. Deer. Case closed in early 1977. Except the story has one more strange twist in it, and it's a human one. Peter Byrne, the man who started all of this, the man who wrote the careful letters and recovered the hair and asked for the favor, Byrne may never have actually received the news. Remember, this was a man who spent his life on expeditions. When the FBI's correspondence went out, Byrne was, by multiple accounts, out of the country, abroad, traveling, possibly back in his beloved Nepal. So the FBI's letters did not reach Byrne directly. They went instead to that Boston group I told you to remember. The Academy of Applied Science, the organization backing his work. A representative there received the FBI's findings and wrote back in March of 1977, thanking the Bureau and saying he would pass the news along to Byrne when the monster hunter returned. And then the file just ends. The correspondence stops. The 22 pages run out. For more than 40 years, that was it. The file sat, complete and quiet, inside the FBI's records, not hidden in a vault by men in dark suits, just filed, closed, unremarkable. One of millions of pieces of paper in a system that enormous. It came back into the light in 2019, and the reason is almost mundane. The FBI maintains a public online reading room, informally known as The Vault, where it posts documents that have been requested by the public under the Freedom of Information Act. On June 5th, 2019, the Bigfoot file went up there, and the FBI's own social media account flagged it. And because it had the words FBI and Bigfoot in the same sentence, the internet did what the internet does. It went everywhere. The Washington Post covered it. History covered it. For a few days, it was one of the most famous documents in the country. And it is worth understanding why a 2019 internet went quite so feral over a 1977 Hare report. Part of it is the FBI vault itself, a reading room holding thousands upon thousands of declassified documents on gangsters, espionage, public corruption, and a file labeled Bigfoot simply does not look like it belongs on that shelf. But part of it is memory. The skeptic Benjamin Radford made the point that in 2019, a lot of people think of Bigfoot as a bit of a joke. But in the 1970s, when this file was alive, Bigfoot was genuinely, enormously popular. This was the era when a primetime hit like The $6 Million Man could give Bigfoot a guest appearance and nobody blinked. So the file is really a time capsule, a snapshot of a moment when a serious researcher, a federal laboratory, and a hit television show could all be circling the same creature at once. But here's the detail I cannot stop thinking about. When reporters reached Peter Byrne in 2019, and he was still alive then, he was in his 90s, living in Oregon, Byrne reacted to the deer result as though he were hearing it for the very first time. As though after all those decades, the answer to his own 40-year-old question was somehow news to him. Maybe it genuinely was. Maybe that letter, passed through the Academy of Applied Science, simply never completed its journey to a man who was forever on his way to somewhere else. Or, and this is the skeptical reading, and I'd be failing you if I left it out, there is another explanation. Benjamin Radford, an editor with Skeptical Inquirer magazine, made a sharp point about this. If you have made a big enough deal of a mysterious specimen to send it all the way to the FBI, you are probably not in a hurry to broadcast the news when it comes back as deer. I am not telling you that is what happened. I am telling you a fair-minded person has to put it on the table. So what does the file actually prove? All right, we've read the whole thing front to back. So let's do the part this channel exists to do and ask the honest question. What does the FBI's Bigfoot file actually prove? Let's start with what it does not prove, because that's where most of the internet gets it wrong. It does not prove Bigfoot is real. A single sample of deer hair is, if anything, the opposite. And it does not prove Bigfoot is fake either. One deer that brushed 2 trees in Oregon tells us nothing about the thousands of other reports across the continent. It proves one sample was deer. That is the honest size of it. It also does not prove a cover-up. I know that's the framing the title of this video plays with, and I told you at the start I'd be straight with you about that word secret. The file was never classified. It was never buried by people trying to keep America from the truth. It was just an old, closed, low-priority file that nobody had a reason to look at until somebody filed the right request. The boring explanation is the correct one. The FBI having a Bigfoot file is not an endorsement of Bigfoot. In exactly the same way that the Pentagon studying unidentified aerial phenomena is not the Pentagon confirming aliens. A government looking into a question is not a government answering it. There's a comparison I keep coming back to. People love the phrase, the FBI has a file on Bigfoot, because the word file does so much dramatic work. It sounds thick, it sounds active, it sounds like a drawer full of secrets. But a file in the FBI's record system can be almost anything. It can be a sprawling multi-year investigation, or it can be, as it is here, 22 pages that are mostly polite letters between a researcher and a lab clerk. Same word, wildly different things. And the gap between what that word implies and what this file actually contains is where most of the Bigfoot FBI mythology lives. But, and I think this is the real payoff, the file is not empty of mystery. The mystery is just not where people think it is. The mystery is that Atlas claim. Go back to it. An official United States Army Corps of Engineers publication, a serious $200,000 reference work, told the American public a specific thing, that the FBI had examined suspected Sasquatch hair and found it matched no known animal. And when two separate parties went looking for the source of that claim, the FBI in its own files and the Atlas's own editor in his, neither one could find it. It came from nowhere. It is, as far as anyone has ever been able to show, a fact with no parent. Think about the chain of custody on a piece of information the way you would think about chain of custody on evidence. A real fact has a trail. Somebody did the test, somebody wrote it down, somebody filed the report, and you can walk that trail backward to the source. This Atlas claim has no trail at all. You walk it backward, and within 2 steps, you are standing in empty air. It is the informational equivalent of a single footprint that starts in the middle of a field, with nothing leading up to it. That is the genuinely unsolved thing in this story. Not, did the FBI find a monster? But how did a sourceless rumor about an FBI test get into a federal government atlas and get printed as established fact? And honestly, that question tells you something true and a little unsettling about how information works. A claim does not need to be true to become official. It just needs enough people to repeat it confidently enough for long enough. And there is one last thing, and it's the part I think a fair person on the believer side gets to keep. The hair sample the FBI tested was returned to Byrne in 1977. It is, almost certainly, long gone now, lost to 50 years of time, which means we will never be able to do to it what we could do today. Run it through modern DNA analysis, the kind that didn't exist in 1977. The verdict of deer was a microscope verdict. It was good science for its day, but it is a door we can no longer walk back through. That sample's final word will always be a 1970s word. So here's where I land, and then I genuinely want to hear where you land. I personally think the FBI's Bigfoot file is one of the most useful documents in this entire subject. And not because of what it found, it is useful because of how it behaves. It is what a real, honest government inquiry into a monster looks like, all the way down. Someone asked a careful question. A serious official gave a serious answer. A real laboratory did real work. And the result was deer. Undramatic, unsatisfying, and almost certainly true. And maybe that is the quiet lesson of the whole file. We tend to want our government documents about monsters to be one of two things: a smoking gun or a flat denial, a cover-up or a debunk. The FBI's Bigfoot file refuses to be either. It is just a record of ordinary people on both sides behaving reasonably. A researcher who checked his facts, an official who answered honestly, a lab that did its job, and a result that closed one small door and completely by accident left a bigger one open. The believers don't get their monster in these pages. But the hardline skeptics don't get a clean win either, because the file hands them a loose thread they cannot tie off, a government publication that printed an unsourceable claim and a famous test that the more you pull on it may never have happened at all. A file with a beginning, an ending, and a hole right in the middle. That is what the FBI released in 2019. And the hole is still open. If you want more of this, real documents, read slowly with the honest parts left in. There's a card on screen for our deep dive on the man in the Patterson-Gimlin film, where we gave the most analyzed footage in history the same evidence-first treatment. A lot of you asked for that one in the comments, and it pairs well with this. But for now, tell me down below. That untraceable atlas claim. Was it sloppy editing, a prank that escaped into an official book, or something the FBI genuinely did off the books and simply never wrote down?
So, we followed a real FBI file from an envelope of 15 hairs all the way to the word deer, and found the real mystery hiding one page over. So, what are your thoughts on all of this? But always remember to keep questioning your sources.